Hey everyone, welcome to the very first video. So before we get into today's topic, I just want to kind of explain what's going on here. I am someone who loves learning, and a couple weeks ago I was bored and I'm like, man, there are so many things in this world that I really just want to learn more about. So I actually have this little bowl full of these little slips where I kind of went through A to Z and came up with a bunch of topics that I'd like to learn more about. Each week I'm going to pull one of these slips out, learn about a different topic, and fill you guys in, hopefully in a very short video. It's my first time, guys. I'm really trying to keep it brief, and I did have to go through and edit a few times to get this video down to a more manageable time to hopefully not bore you guys half to death. So today's video is actually about Iceland, but if you look at the slip, I don't know if I can get it on there well enough, but I was kind of in a hurry. It does say ICELAND, but when I googled that, I wasn't really getting a whole lot of information, so I hope you guys will settle for the video about Iceland today. So Iceland itself is an isolated island. It's located in the North Atlantic Ocean, and it's known as the land of fire and ice. The word Iceland in its native tongue really just means island, so there's nothing horrible or scary about it. The climate there is actually pretty moderate. They have cool summers and pretty mild winters. It does storm there quite often, but that's because it's an island, so they're surrounded by water. They're obviously going to have a lot of rain. Something interesting about Iceland is that there's really no prehistory there. And what I mean by that is that you're not going to find cave drawings, you're not going to find fossils of prehistoric animals or man of any kind. It's a small island. If we were going to compare it to a US state, it'd be about the size of Kentucky. So Iceland is known to have been discovered and founded in the year 874. However, the very first written documentation of these settlers doesn't actually come to light until the year 1130. So we're looking at 250 years after this actually happened. However, surprisingly, these records do seem to be pretty accurate, and there's some scientific data that backs up this timeline. So most scholars do accept it as the truth. So the first people to come here in 874 were from Norway. A man and his wife, who were farmers, settled in the southwest region of the island, which is now the capital. These 400 original settlers mostly came from Norway. They brought with them their family, their servants, and their slaves. And their slaves and servants mostly would have been of Western European descent. So although it's said that this area wasn't discovered until that time, it's pretty widely believed that the people of the time already knew about the island. A Greek explorer named Pytheas talked about an island named Thule, and he said that it was a 6-day sail north of England. This fits Iceland. Later on, some Irish hermits would seek solitude at an island that they also called Thule, although it's completely impossible to know whether or not the two were talking about the same island. It is interesting, however, that Thule in itself is a setting in a lot of literature, all the way even to Edgar Allan Poe, and it's known as the farthest place on earth, which I know all of us would kind of like to go to sometimes, so I did find that pretty interesting. When it was settled, the Nordic people worshipped many gods, and societal laws were imposed by people who were known as the Godai. They were basically the religious leaders of the time, and they imposed the laws and they kind of ruled over the farmers. It's interesting because these Godar, which is the plural of Godai, were run by 5 families, and in true Hollywood fashion, these families would later go on to feud. There'd be tons of violence and bloodshed. And this even continued after Christianity became pretty common in Iceland. This religion also led to some pretty extensive mythology. The most common of these pagan gods would probably be Thor. The most powerful was Odin. By the 12th century, the Icelandic people had pretty much adopted Christianity because their king told them to. He sent a lot of missionaries, and these missionaries were known to be very successful in their endeavors. The land itself was not rich in natural resources. In fact, there is only one animal native to Iceland, and that would be the Arctic fox. It's believed to have traveled there during a previous ice age across some sort of ice bridge. And there is also only one tree that is native to Iceland, and that's the birch tree. Birch is a softwood, and it's not really good for construction. So most lumber was imported to the island. Excuse me. Despite these setbacks, early Icelandic society was prosperous. The land proved to be well suited for cattle and sheep, and both were raised for milk and for meat. Sheep are also really good for wool, and quickly the main export became homespun cloth. There was some agriculture, but grain was very difficult in the soil in Iceland, and so most grains were also imported to the region. Between 1380 and 1473, there was a lot of political unrest, and I'm going to try and keep this part really brief. There's a whole lot of information out there if you're interested, but it really had to do with trade rights and fishing. And fishing is a long battle when it comes to Iceland. It's something that's been really monopolized in that region and kept away from the little guy from being able to make a living off of. By the early 16th century, England's interest in Icelandic fishing products had really died down, mostly because rich fishing grounds were found off of the North American coast of Newfoundland. So this kind of squashed a lot of the problems that were going on at that point in time. Iceland's economy deteriorated in the late Middle Ages. Birchwood was depleted in part because it was excellent for making charcoal. So the destruction of those woodlands together with the overgrazing led to terrible soil erosion, and now growing grain was completely impossible, and the people gave up on it altogether. Twice in the 15th century, the plague visited the island. Each time it killed 50% of the population. In 1703, the first census was taken, and the population at that time was 50,358. The most common occupation was farmer, although it's important to note that there was another auxiliary occupation that was pretty common, which was that of fishermen. However, again, the government did a great job of monopolizing fishing, and that's why it's not known as a main occupation on this census. In the 18th century, things got even worse. Famine struck, caused by a volcanic eruption, followed by years of cold weather. And here, 1/5 of the population was lost. And at this point in time, I just want to take a moment to point out what's currently going on in Iceland. If you're not aware of what's going on, in the past couple of weeks, there have literally been thousands of earthquakes going on in the southwestern region of Iceland. And this is an indicator to geologists that magma is rising to the surface. They're pretty worried that another volcanic eruption is imminent. And some towns have already been evacuated. You can imagine that on an island that's as small as the state of Kentucky, this could be pretty catastrophic. And history doesn't lie, right? So, back to the history. From 1830 to 1904, Iceland struggled for independence. And after gaining it, there was a lot of rapid progress in the nation. Things as simple as putting motors into fishing boats, because again, fishing is power on this in Iceland, on this island nation. It was a great time of success. There was a university founded. People just saw it as what they had been fighting for. But then all of a sudden, war broke out. And I'm not talking about in Iceland, but I'm talking about around the world. And although these battles were not taking place on this island, the nations that ruled over them still, such as Denmark, such as Norway, were directly involved in these battles. So this really shook up the political stance in Iceland, and a lot more change took place. Luckily, it was in the favor of the people of Iceland. And on June 17th, 1944, the current nation of Iceland, as we know it today, was founded. That day is now known as National Day. In the 2000s, there was a lot of financial trouble in Iceland, to the point that the government took control of the 3 largest privately owned banks in the nation. One of these banks then failed. So the government was really on the hook. And the British and Dutch governments actually sued Iceland to try and recover funds. This case went all the way to the European Free Trade Association Court. That's a mouthful. But in 2013, they rejected these claims. Outwardly, the women's rights movement in Iceland is way ahead of its time. And while they still deal with some problems like equal pay, this can be seen with the first female president of any nation being elected right there in Iceland. She was elected in 1980, and she actually served 4 full terms all the way up until 1996. In 2009, the world's first openly gay prime minister was elected, and you guessed it, right there in Iceland. And guess what? She was a woman too. So, I know that wasn't super brief, but that's as briefly as I felt like I could get through the history of an entire nation. And I'd just like to take a couple minutes to conclude with some fun facts, because what would an informational video be without those, right? So here we go. Beer was illegal in Iceland until 1989. You heard that right. I was born in 1979, just to put that into some perspective for you guys. Iceland has no military, and they completely rely on NATO. Next up, there are only 2 places on Earth that do not have mosquitoes: Antarctica, and you guessed it, Iceland. Iceland also has no snakes, scorpions, or poisonous spiders. So, hey, you might want to consider a vacation. Of course, after all this volcanic eruption stuff hopefully calms down. Next up, there are no McDonald's in Iceland. This one is particularly funny for me because I randomly pulled a topic out of a bowl and happened to select the one place on Earth where there's just no McDonald's. All right, this is a good one. According to Christmas traditions, there are 13 Santa Clauses called Yule Lads, and these guys bear some pretty unappealing names. A couple of them would be Sausage Snatcher and Window Peeper. To make the holidays even more uncomfortable, a giant Yule cat stalks the countryside on the hunt for children who have not been gifted clothes for Christmas. All right, I got one more for you guys. During the summer, Iceland experiences up to 24 hours of daylight, and this is known as the midnight sun. So I hope that everybody learned something today. I learned so much more than I could even tell you guys about in this video. And last thing on the docket, we're going to go ahead and select our next topic, totally at random. Hopefully it's not another I. All right, and hopefully I know how to spell this time. So next week's video will be about rabbits. All right, till next time, folks. Thanks so much for tuning in. I know this one might have been a bit rough. It's my first time. Go easy on me. Gonna get better as we go along. Till next time, take care.